I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about mixed-use development, and I'm going to kind of walk through a couple different sections in this video. We're going to talk about what is mixed-use development and what is one of the major barriers to mixed-use development and its success. We're going to talk about unintended consequences in mixed-use development, and then we're going to talk about, what can communities do, what can people do, how can we advocate for mixed-use development in a way that avoids some of those that avoids some of those unintended consequences. So first, what is mixed use development? There is multi-use development and mixed use. Traditionally, mixed use development is vertically integrated development that has more than one type of use. So it's ground floor retail with residential on top. It's ground floor retail with office space on top. It is a combination of ground floor retail, office space, and multifamily. That is vertical mixed use development. There's also multiple use development, which is one parcel gets developed, one project gets developed and has multiple horizontal uses, right? So you have a grocery store adjacent to multifamily or residential. You've got office and commercial space adjacent to residential, but those are not vertically stacked. I would call that multi-use development, and mixed use is vertically stacked. So that's what is mixed use development. This conversation got started a few weeks ago when there was this question posed to me by a local elected official around, is mixed use development the future? Or they've heard that mixed use development is dead and it's not going to happen. And what that brought up in my mind is I think mixed use development can be the future where there's demand for it and where the development patterns and demand patterns support that development. It can work really well. And we've got some awesome projects around town that support that thesis. The challenge we've seen in some local municipalities is that the mixed use development is desired, people want it, but the kind of foundational elements that make for successful mixed use development aren't in place. So I'll share a link to a video I did before that goes over the one factor that all development needs to be successful, and that is if you can't get the rent, you can't build the building, right? That is the base truth about private sector development. If you can't get the rent, and I'll link it right above, you can't build the building. The challenge with mixed use development is now you're not only looking at the overall map and saying, hey, where are rents high enough to support the development I want to do? But you've actually are looking at kind of a Venn diagram of two separate uses. So in the case of ground floor retail with multifamily above, you're looking at your overall community and saying, okay, where are the rents high enough for the retail to be developed, right? And that's in one part of town. And then you've also got to look at where the rent's high enough to support multifamily development. Sometimes those spaces overlap, but often they don't. You might have a section of town that has really high demand for multifamily, but not retail. You might have part of town that has really high demand for retail, but not multifamily. And so again, you're taking the overall map and chopping it down into much smaller areas. And then you're trying to find the overlap of two of those very small areas. And what results is a very tiny sliver of any community that might be adequate, have adequate rents that are high enough for both retail and multifamily, or retail and office, or retail, office, and multifamily if you want to go to three criteria. So again, by definition, you're looking at a very small part of town. There's also the underlying zoning aspect, right? Does the site where these demands are high enough, does it have existing zoning, or do you have to go through a rezoning? And if it has to go through a rezoning, does the future land use map say that that is a desirable location for that type of zoning? So again, the biggest challenge with mixed-use development is if it's applicable at all, if demands are high enough at all for this type of development, they're going to be in very, very select and very, very small portions of your community. And you've also got to take into consideration the cost aspect. Both the retail and the multifamily development are going to be more expensive when stacked together than if they were separate. So any use that you combine is going to cost more money to develop than if they were separate. And so you got to factor in the fact that not only the rents have to be there, they've got to be higher than they would for separate uses. So that is a major barrier. What we often see happening when it comes to unintended consequences is a community will say, we really want to see mixed use development. And if you're coming into town and you want to develop multifamily, we're going to require you or really advocate or really push to have ground floor retail, right? Ground floor retail under multifamily is successful, and we've seen it work in other markets, and we want to bring that here. The problem is if you require that in an area that doesn't have the rents to support it, you're faced with this vacancy unintended consequence where you may have rents high enough to support multifamily and support the added cost of building the ground floor retail, but the developer has assumed that that space will never get leased up. And so if your only option is not doing a multifamily project or doing a multifamily project with vacant retail and the numbers work, you find sometimes that that's what gets built. So the unintended consequence is you've required there to be ground floor retail built, but you can't require that it gets leased up. That's a function of the market. And so you wind up with this vacant space. So what's a community to do? Well, one approach would be a more incremental approach to this mixed use zoning. Instead of saying, hey, if you're going to build multifamily, you have to include retail. What if you started to test the market and see if retail is supported in areas throughout town, right? Could you add the availability or the ability to build accessory commercial units, ACUs, in predominantly historically residential parts of town? Could you allow for food trucks to go into these parts of the community to see if food and beverage demand is there to support restaurants, right? These are incremental approaches that would allow you to test to see if it works, to see if the demand is there without going in and having the unintended consequence of vacant ground floor retail. The other approach is to go the other way. Can you look at predominantly commercial spaces and start densifying them with accessory dwelling units or residential to see if there's demand there? And then you'll find in those areas where those projects are successful, you may in fact have the demand for both residential and retail or residential and office, and then your mixed use projects are much more likely to be successful without the unintended consequences of vacancy. Love to hear what you think about these ideas. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them below. Thank you.